On the night of August 7th, 1960, the streets of Abidjan erupted. Ivory Coast was free. After decades of French rule, the tricolor came down and a new flag went up. Speeches were made. Crowds sang. Leaders embraced. Independence finally had arrived. The same scenes repeated across West and Central Africa throughout 1960. Senegal in June, Mali in June, Benin in August, Burkina Faso in August, Chad in August, the Central African Republic in August, the Republic of Congo in August, Gabon in August. One by one, 14 nations reclaimed their sovereignty. The colonial era, the world was told, was over. Nobody mentioned the currency. Because while the flags changed and the speeches rang out and the new governments took office, something stayed exactly where it had always been, in Paris. The money, the reserves, the monetary policy, the printing presses, the exchange rate, the power to decide at any moment what an African nation's currency was worth. All of it remained under French control. Not because anyone had forgotten to change it, not because the transition was incomplete, because France had designed it that way. 2 decades before the independence celebrations began, on December 26, 1945, while these countries were still colonies and had no voice in the matter whatsoever. The system has a name. It is called the CFA Franc. France calls it monetary cooperation. 80 years on, 210 million people in 14 African countries are still living inside it. I'm Malcolm. This is History Meets Economics, where every video will change how you see money, history, and the systems controlling your life. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what France built in 1945 was not just a currency. It was a mechanism. A way to keep the economic benefits of empire running long after the political embarrassment of empire had been abandoned. And it is still running today. Do you think the CFA Franc is monetary cooperation or monetary control? Drop your comment below. We read every single one. Let's start with the name, because the name itself tells the story. When the CFA Franc was created by decree of General de Gaulle in December 1945, CFA stood for Colonies Françaises d'Afrique, French Colonies of Africa. That was the official, printed, unapologetic name of the currency. A currency named after the people it was designed to serve, and those people were colonies. After independence became inconvenient to ignore, France quietly changed what the acronym stood for. In West Africa, it became Communauté Financière d'Afrique, African Financial Community. In Central Africa, Coopération Financière en Afrique Centrale, Financial Cooperation in Central Africa. The letters stayed the same. The currency stayed the same. The mechanics stayed the same. Only the explanation changed, which is, in a way, a remarkably accurate summary of what happened to French colonialism in Africa overall. The mechanics of the CFA Franc system were built around 3 pillars, and each one deserves examination. Not because they are complicated, they are not. Because they are so straightforward and so plainly constructed to serve one party over another that stating them clearly is the most damning thing one can do. The first pillar, the exchange rate is fixed in Paris, and Africa does not set it. The CFA franc is pegged to the euro at a rate of exactly 655.957 CFA francs to 1 euro. That rate does not move based on the economic conditions of Senegal or Chad or Cameroon. It does not adjust when harvests fail or commodity prices collapse or unemployment rises. It is fixed, permanently, by agreement with France. And because it is pegged to the euro, rather than reflecting the actual productive capacity of African economies, it consistently keeps African exports more expensive than they would be under a freely floating currency, which is precisely the opposite of what developing, export-dependent economies need. To understand what a fixed, overvalued exchange rate does to an economy, consider 1994. For years before that, the CFA franc had been dramatically overvalued. African economists had been warning about it. The IMF had been warning about it. The evidence was sitting plainly in the trade data. Then, in January 1994, France made a decision. It devalued the CFA franc by 50% overnight. Not the African governments. France. Unilaterally. Without a referendum, without a parliamentary vote in any of the 14 affected countries, without asking the 200 million people whose savings and salaries were about to lose half their value. The price of imported goods, medicine, fuel, food doubled immediately. Wages did not. African governments, scrambling to respond, had no monetary tools available to cushion the blow because they controlled none of those tools. Economists estimate that the devaluation pushed millions of people below the poverty line within months. France announced it regretfully, but said it was necessary. The people who paid the price were not asked their opinion. The second pillar, The reserves go to Paris. For decades after independence, the 14 CFA Franc countries were required to deposit 100% of their foreign exchange reserves into an account at the French Treasury called the operations account. 100%. Every dollar earned from exports, every unit of foreign currency held by the central bank, sat in Paris. The rate was eventually reduced to 65% in 1973 to 50% in 2005. But the principle remained. African nations could not freely deploy their own reserves. The money was accessible in theory, but the architecture of control remained intact. In 2019, following sustained pressure from African economists and politicians, France announced a reform for the 8 West African countries in the system. They would no longer be required to deposit reserves in Paris. It was presented as a historic step toward African monetary sovereignty, and in a narrow technical sense, it was. But 2 things happened alongside that announcement that received considerably less coverage. First, France announced that the West African CFA Franc would be renamed the ECO. This is where the story takes a turn that requires a moment of appreciation for its audacity. The Economic Community of West African States, a body of 15 nations, including Nigeria, Ghana, and Guinea, had been planning their own currency called the ECO for nearly 20 years. Their version would have covered the entire region, including the non-CFA countries, creating a genuine pan-African monetary bloc with real economic weight. By announcing a francophone-only ECO first, France effectively hijacked the name, created confusion, and complicated an integration project that would have moved the center of West African monetary gravity from Paris to Lagos. To this day, the original ECO project has not launched. The 5th target date is currently set for July 2027. Whether it will be met is a question that requires a certain optimism about the pace at which these things tend to move. Second, the reform applied only to the 8 West African countries. The 6 Central African countries, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, the Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon, remain fully inside the old system. Their central bank, the Bank of Central African States, is still required to deposit 50% of foreign exchange reserves with the French Treasury. French representatives still sit on its board. Nothing about their situation has changed. They were not mentioned prominently in the reform announcement. The 3rd pillar, the physical currency, is made in France. Every CFA Franc banknote and coin is produced at the Chamelaires factory in France, operated by the Bank of France. The currency of 14 sovereign African nations is physically manufactured in a factory in the French countryside. African governments place orders. The Bank of France produces the notes. They are shipped to Africa. This is not a secret. It is simply a fact that is rarely stated plainly, perhaps because stating it plainly makes it sound like what it is. Now consider what all 3 pillars produce together. Countries that cannot set their own interest rates, countries that cannot devalue their currency in response to economic shocks, countries that could not, for decades, freely use their own reserves, countries that cannot print their own money without placing an order with a European central bank, countries whose exchange rate is calibrated to European economic conditions rather than African ones. Togolese economist Kako Nubukbo, one of the most prominent African critics of the system, called it voluntary servitude. Chad's President Idriss Deby, speaking at independence celebrations in 2015, said there was a cord preventing development in Africa that must be severed. He was referring to the CFA Franc. The cord, at the time of his speech, was 70 years old. The question that every defender of the system raises at this point is stability, and it is not an entirely unfair question. The CFA Franc has produced lower inflation than many African currencies. The average inflation rate in CFA Franc countries over the past 50 years has been substantially lower than in comparable non-CFA African economies. In a continent where currency crises have caused enormous human suffering, that consistency has real value. Senegal has not experienced hyperinflation. Ivory Coast has not seen its savings wiped out overnight by a collapsing exchange rate. These are not trivial things. But stability for whom, doing what, producing what outcomes, is the more precise question. A currency that is stable because it cannot respond to the needs of the economy it serves is not providing stability. It is providing rigidity dressed up as reliability. The CFA Franc has kept inflation low in countries where inflation has been far from the primary obstacle to development. It has not kept those countries from being among the poorest on earth. Burkina Faso was in the CFA Franc zone and ranks among the 10 least developed countries on the United Nations Human Development Index. Niger is in the CFA Franc zone and ranks last. The Central African Republic is in the CFA Franc zone. Mali is in the CFA Franc zone. Chad is in the CFA Franc zone. 8 of the 14 countries in the system are classified by the United Nations as least developed countries. The argument that the CFA Franc has delivered prosperity rather than simply delivered low inflation in profoundly poor countries is a claim the data does not make comfortably. Monetary stability and human development are not the same thing. France has provided the first. The second remains, across much of the CFA zone, elusive. The one country that said no, loudly and immediately, was Guinea. In 1958, Guinea's first president, Scoutour, rejected the French community entirely and chose full independence over the monetary and political arrangements France was offering. De Gaulle, by various accounts, was not gracious about it. French officials leaving Guinea are reported to have smashed telephones, ripped out electrical wiring, and burned administrative files rather than leave a functioning state behind. France withdrew all technical assistance within 2 months. It withdrew its currency. Guinea was forced to create its own money, the Guinean franc, almost overnight, with no institutional support and no transition period. It is widely documented that France subsequently engaged in destabilization efforts against the Tour government for years, including allegedly flooding Guinea with counterfeit currency to undermine its new monetary system. Guinea's independence, in other words, was punished, comprehensively, deliberately, and as a message. The lesson for other African leaders watching was not subtle. You could have independence, or you could have French goodwill and the currency system that came with it. Choosing both, apparently, was not on the table. Those who doubt whether the arrangement has historically served France's interests rather than Africa's might note the following. France is the 5th largest economy in the world. It has maintained extraordinary diplomatic, military, and commercial influence across 14 African countries for 80 years at minimal cost, backed by the structural dependency of a currency system those countries cannot easily exit. France has permanent military bases across CFA zone countries including Chad, Ivory Coast, Gabon, and Senegal. French companies have won disproportionate shares of infrastructure, energy, uranium extraction, and telecommunications contracts across the zone for decades. Niger, one of the world's poorest countries and a CFA Franc member, sits on some of the largest uranium deposits on Earth. For years, French nuclear company Areva extracted that uranium under terms widely criticized as deeply unfavorable. France generated approximately 75% of its electricity from nuclear power. The connection between the two facts was rarely made explicit in French public discourse. In 2023, following a military coup that explicitly cited resentment of French economic and political influence, Niger expelled the French ambassador and demanded the withdrawal of French troops. Mali and Burkina Faso had preceded it with similar expulsions. The CFA Franc system did not cause all of this resentment. But it has been, for 80 years, its most persistent and visible symbol. It was designed in 1945 by Frenchmen, for French purposes, with no African input, while the people it would govern were still colonial subjects rather than citizens. France calls this monetary cooperation. The November 2024 Sciences Po survey found that 95% of West Africans want to leave the system. Cooperation, as a concept, typically requires that the cooperating parties want to cooperate. So here is what the record shows. 210 million people are living inside a monetary system that was designed in 1945 to serve the interests of a colonial power that stripped African nations of the primary tools of economic management at the moment of their independence, that devalued their savings by 50% in a single announcement in 1994 without their consent, that required them to park their own foreign exchange reserves in a foreign capital for decades, and that still, in 2025, 80 years after its creation, keeps 6 Central African countries. Inside arrangements that have not meaningfully changed since the era of colonialism ended, while the promised reform for the other 8 remains incomplete, and the renamed eco-currency has yet to launch after 5 missed target dates. The flags changed in 1960. The architecture of monetary control did not. It was renamed. The colonizers went home. The system they built stayed, updated its letterhead, and continued calling the relationship mutual. A currency named Colonies Françaises d'Afrique became, through a quiet administrative decision, an African financial community. The people inside it remained the same. The poverty indicators inside it remained among the worst on earth. The French treasury remained on the other end of the wire, holding reserves, overseeing board meetings, and printing the banknotes. There is a version of this story in which France argues, in good faith, that the CFA Franc has provided genuine benefits, monetary stability, lower inflation, access to a credible exchange rate anchor, and that the alternative would have produced greater suffering. That argument has serious economists on its side and deserves honest engagement. But it does not explain why the people living inside the system want out by a margin of 95 to 5. It does not explain why Guinea was punished so comprehensively for leaving. It does not explain why the reform of 2019 was partial, delayed, and presented as French generosity rather than the product of decades of African pressure. And it does not explain why, 80 years after its creation, the currency of 14 sovereign nations is still printed in a factory in the Auvergne. France calls it cooperation. The economists who have studied it longest call it a system designed to extract rather than develop. The presidents of the countries inside it have called it, in public speeches, a cord around their economies. And the people living under it, surveyed in 2024, won out by a margin of 95-5. Every economic crisis has a paper trail. History just knows where to look. And so do you now. And I'll see you in the next one. I'm Malcolm, and this is where history meets economics. Subscribe now. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain. Here's another moment where history met economics.